Hello everyone. Good evening. Hello, my name is Maddie and I'm a summer program assistant here at the Fine Arts Work Center. And most of you are here because you're participating in one of our amazing summer workshops. But for those of you who aren't, for 9 weeks every summer, the Work Center hosts week-long open enrollment visual arts and writing workshops. If anyone here is interested in learning more, you can ask me or any of the staff on hand after this event. And if you're here longer than this week, you should really think about taking one of our workshops. I promise you won't regret it. So one of our favorite parts of our summer programs is that every week our world-class faculty mesmerize our audiences with presentations and talks. Tonight we're going to hear from 2 faculty members. Writer Elissa Altman will read from her work, and visual artist David Hilliard will make a presentation. These will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping and other bits of interest. Books by Elissa and David will be on sale at the back of the room after the event. Elissa and David will then also be signing their books for you up here at the front of the room. Other books from this year's faculty will also be for sale in our bookstore and at the back of the room, as well as some very pretty Falk merchandise, so be sure to check it out. The new Hudson D. Walker Gallery will be open after the event. Right now, we're showing an amazing exhibit called Density's Glitch, which features work by former Falk Fellows. The proceeds of all work sold will go to support Falk's programs, so be sure to check it out after this event. And finally, I would like to give a big shout out to our partners who've been so generous. They include Relish, who provided us with our yummy breakfast treats all week, Cosmos, who provided our delicious boxed meals on our first night, East End Books, who've helped us stock and set up our bookstore. Restrooms are located down the hall to your left behind you. And finally, please do us all a favor and turn your cell phones to silent. So we will begin with writer Elissa Altman, who's teaching a workshop this week called Permission and the New Memoirist. Elissa is the James Beard Award-winning author of 3 memoirs, Motherland, Treyf, and Poor Man's Feast. Her work has appeared in LitHub, Orion, Narrative, The Rumpus, On Being, The Washington Post, and beyond, and has been widely anthologized. She has appeared live on the TEDx stage, at the Public Theater in New York with Wallace Shawn, regularly on NPR, and in 2020 was a finalist in memoir for the Lambda and Maine Literary Awards. Her writing has been praised as being, quote, brave and generous, and the Kirkus Reviews described her memoir writing as funny, raw, and tender. The Lambda Literary Review called her books, quote, a lived, complicated work of lyrically wrought prose with a quiet surprise on every page. She lives in Connecticut, and we're so fortunate to have her here with us this week. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Elissa Altman.
Thank you for the howling. It's very nice. First, please forgive me. I don't know how many of you are suffering from allergies to the extent that I am, but I might sound like Brenda Vaccaro halfway through. So if you even remember who she is, okay. Midnight Count. So first of all, thank you so much, David and Sarah and everyone who's involved in bringing us back here. I cannot express to you how amazing it is to be back here after such a long haul. This is like another home for me, and I see a lot of people, students of mine who have been here in previous workshops, and I'm just very, very grateful to be here. So I thank you. I should just start by saying that what I'm going to read, the piece that I'm going to read, it comes out of the workshop that I lead, that I'm leading this summer, which is about permission. And it's something that is very near and dear to my heart, and it's near and dear to most artists' hearts. The idea that we have to have permission to produce, to make the art that we want to make, because at some point we were either told we can't or we shouldn't, or culturally we're expected not to, and yet we feel the pull and the need to make that art. And what happens when you sort of jump in with both feet and you make the decision to write perhaps the thing that you are not supposed to write. My memoirs, all of them have been about, primarily about family. The most recent one, Motherland, which came out in 2019, was particularly complicated. And it was really a craft. It was very complicated because I was writing it from the inside of the story while the story was unfolding, so I had no idea how the story was going to end. Not recommended, but interesting, interesting. So out of those memoirs and many essays has come the question of permission. Who gets to say what we can write or paint or produce whatever kind of art we produce? Who gets to say we can do it or not? So this piece, it comes from my new book, which has its roots in this workshop, and it's called On Permission, and it's going to be published in 2024, so it's in process right now. And this is the first time I've read from it, actually. So, and this is called Whose Story Is It? We are a tribe of natural storytellers, truth proprietors, dream weavers. We speak for and over each other as a matter of course. Oral historians torn from Talmudic cloth, we recreate family myths and legends as much to claim ownership of them as to throw younger members off scent when we believe they're too young to manage the tragedy of their own history. We laugh easily, argue passionately, are in love with the human fabric and color of personal chronicle. Our own family stories and tales morph and mutate with every retelling across the generations like a game of telephone, until the thin, sharp line of fact becomes frayed and hazy like a figure shrinking in a rearview mirror. That's not the way it happened, a cousin tells me when I recount the story of a particular event from my childhood at which she was not present. We pass the gravy, we pour the wine, we correct and lovingly admonish. That's not the way it happened. She repeats this phrase that peals like a bell at our at our holiday table. Forks drop, heads turn, silence, glaring, an accusation. She's certain of her position, even though she wasn't there to witness it. The way I've told it defies the family narrative she's created for herself. When someone tells you that the story you've shared didn't unfold the way you told it or wrote it, they are calling you a liar or a fabricator. In my family, the truth is often veiled behind storm clouds of possession. Even if your story is yours, the message warns, the truth is not yours to tell. You don't have permission. During the 16 months that it took for me to write my first memoir, a plating together of food, family, and love, both filial and romantic, a story of how we are hardwired for sustenance and nurturing, and how they redeem the broken soul, I lay awake every night knowing that the fulcrum of the story, of my story, was teetering on someone else's. Nearly a century ago, my long-dead paternal grandmother, the elfin one who used to stand in the kitchen in her gold vinyl slippers making gefilte fish for Sabbath dinner, walked out on her husband and children. My aunt, who was in her 90s at the time of the book's publication, believed herself successful in concealing from her own tidy, upper-middle-class, country-clubbing American family the tale of her mother's leaving because, in the Nietzschean practice of active forgetfulness, the philosopher described it as a doorkeeper, an upholder of psychic order, of rest, of etiquette. It didn't fit her narrative. In part, she was successful in hiding it. One of her grown children didn't know about the abandonment of our parents by our grandmother until she was in her 60s. One younger cousin had been told that it was actually my grandfather who left in order to throw her off scent and protect the myth of the perfect mother. Another cousin heard different versions of the story from the time she was a teenager. In deference to my aunt's unshakable conviction that her mother's leaving was a deep, dark family secret, even though everyone knew about it in one form or another, it was never openly discussed, at least not in my aunt's presence. On the other hand, my father, who died 20 years ago, spent his life making the story of his mother's desertion part of the air we breathed in my childhood home. From the time I could understand spoken language, I listened to my father ruminate over his mother's truncated abandonment. She eventually returned. At the dinner table, in the car, on vacation, as blithely as one might discuss the weather. I was a nervous child and became so completely possessed by the possibility that a mother could go out to an afternoon matinee at the local movie theater and simply not come back, that separation anxiety ruled my life far longer and more intensely than it should have, even as an adult. Dolly Parton's hit song, To Daddy, where the child narrator wakes up to find a note saying that her mother has left, sends me into a tailspin even now. When Laura Brown, the suicidal post-war American housewife, who in Michael Cunningham's The Hours leaves her young son Richard with a babysitter to spend the afternoon alone in a hotel room in which she intends to kill herself, her child's shrieks of "come back" as she drives away are blood-curdling. He knows viscerally what her plans are. We learn at the end of the story that she did abandon her family after all, and her son, an award-winning poet dying of AIDS, has dedicated his abbreviated life to metabolizing the fact of her leaving on the page in both his poetry and his fiction. It's a story that he cannot possibly stop telling. Every writer is a subversive, whether they believe themselves to be or not. Every painter, every photographer, every artist who creates something from nothing is, in doing, a truth teller. James Baldwin wrote, "Every writer has only one story to tell, and he has to find a way of telling it until the meaning becomes clearer and clearer, until the story becomes at once more narrow and larger, more and more precise, more and more reverberating." And he did so with the knowledge that clarity often comes hand in hand because of subversion. If writers write because we want to get to the core of the truth, we will almost always have to face the fact that we will not only turn over the apple cart, we will often set it ablaze. We write to unravel our narratives, to define them and our place in them. We write our stories to tighten the aperture on our lives. And our stories invariably are intertwined and coiled around the stories of others. Like my father, whose relentless recounting of the tale of his abandonment in the most mundane of ways was an attempt to codify a grief that could not be contained, I searched for comfort and reassurance of safety and security everywhere, ultimately finding it in two places: in the grounding, nurturing act of cooking, and in the retelling of his abandonment story, its impact on me, and the unpacking of the silent narrative of shame in an effort to heal from it. As a writer and a storyteller, I am less interested in the apparent ruthlessness of my grandmother's leaving, and instead I search for the humanity behind her decision. Had she been beaten by my grandfather? Was she in love with someone else, pregnant with another man's wife, suffering from the clinical depression that every one of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren won fatally? Because I want to know the truth, and because it's the piece of the story that no one ever manages to get to. We need to see the cunning of the innocent and the loneliness of the monster, writes Vivian Gornick in The Situation in the Story. No one is all good or all bad, with the possible exception of some politicians, and not always then. Famous. Doris Lessing walks out on her two eldest children and husband in Rhodesia and moves to London for her career, believing that motherhood and the making of art are mutually exclusive. Not famous. My stocky Jewish grandmother from the old country leaves her husband and children at the start of the Depression. It never mattered that she came back 3 years later. The shame carried by the abandoned parties became the family intaglio, engraved in stone. I was born almost 40 years after she left, but the truth of my grandmother's leaving is my story, as much a part of me as the color of my eyes. This is an exercise in epigenetics. It made my father who he was and me who I am. I search endlessly for sustenance, for safety, for my tribe. My writing hinges on that story, no matter what I write. It captivates me and haunts me. But my students ask, if it didn't happen directly to you, was it yours to tell? In writing memoir, who owns your truth? Who owns your story if it involves someone else? Is a secret really a secret if everyone knows about it? The work of memoir is, at best, fraught. The obstinate clench of the past rules the present, not only on paper, but in our oral traditions. That's why oral traditions exist in the first place, so that we can face our past and know exactly who we are and where we came from. We tell stories over and over to heal our tragedies and share our joys and assure ourselves of the continuity of our place in the human condition. The truths that we reveal in memoir, unless we've spent our lives as hermits, are, by their nature, implicitly connected to the truths of others. That said, who are we to borrow the history of others, alive or dead, whose stories are interesting, compelling, touching, or devastating, but whose lives have not touched our own? What right do we have to rifle those lives of their flowers, to mangle a Woolfian phrase, and use them as the core of our own? We have no right to them. Those stories don't belong to us. We also don't get to character assassinate people, alive or dead, because it's convenient revenge masquerading as art. An important writer I know famously works out her rage at colleagues, former friends, and family members on the page. Her work is lyrical enough that she gets away with it because she is widely recognized as being too dangerous to cross. And don't ask me who that is, because I'm not going to tell you. Story ownership is predicated on there being an unquestionable through line that runs from someone else's life directly into and around your own, ensnaring it. Experience, separated by generation, decade, time, and place, can still be shared experience, even if you've never met that person. The facts of intergenerational trauma are scientifically indisputable. We carry them at the cellular level like the color of eyes. But if we tell the truth about, for example, a Jewish family matriarch's heinous behavior to her Bavarian housekeeper in post-war Long Island, something we as a child witnessed at a 1960s cocktail party when the matriarch thought we weren't looking, because it ground into the family fiber the unmistakable odor of revenge, and we write about it, we will most certainly hear from surviving parties. When Honor Moore wrote about her late father, Bishop Paul Moore, revealing him to his community as a bisexual, she was publicly pilloried in The New Yorker by her siblings as it not being her story to tell because he had gone to such extraordinary lengths, he thought, to hide the reality of his life, enlisting, overtly perhaps, his other children in the keeping of the secret. Moore had spent a lifetime concealing her father's orientation, and who the hell was she, his supposed beloved daughter, to reveal them when he was no longer around to defend himself? She had every right. Herself a bisexual, as was her maternal grandmother, painter Margaret Sargent, about whom she wrote in her memoir, The White Blackbird, Moore's life was indisputably and profoundly touched by her father's sexuality. She could in no way write about or understand her own life without writing about his. It was very brave of you to call me, my aunt said coldly when I phoned to wish her a happy Jewish New Year, as tradition requires one does with the oldest member of the family. My first book had come out 6 months earlier, and we hadn't spoken since. But your story was not yours to tell, she added, taking nearly an hour to explain how I had single-handedly destroyed our family by revealing a truth that she had spent almost a century concealing, convinced all the while that she had been successful, even as her brother had fed me the story like pablum from the time I could understand words. I loved you, my aunt said to me at last. And then she hung up, and she would never take my calls or speak to me ever again. Over the years, I came to fathom why my father was intent on drilling into me the story of his mother's leaving. Because we are a family of abandonment. Rejection is a key part of our core history, and as Baldwin wrote, one that I would write about over and over like a chronic hand washer. Themes of primal rejection and its sister, shame, play themselves out repeatedly in the narrative of every generation. In writing the memoir I did, I endeavored to understand my own story, and therefore my family's, to break the chain and free myself from the strictures of shame that encapsulated the myth of a mother leaving behind her husband and children almost a century ago. In writing about her, she has morphed from a one-dimensional gefilte fish-making demon to a human being, a young immigrant woman stuck in the bardo between the old world and the new, grasping for some semblance of power. When writers move from the silent to the spoken, they shed light and create life where there was darkness and shame. Still, the most difficult decision that any memoirist faces is whether or not our own kernel of truth is important enough to the story to honor and to share. Without that kernel, a memoir has no soul, and with it, we risk everything. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Elissa. That was wonderful, so fascinating. Let's have another round of applause. Before we go on, I just want to remind all the writing students in this room tonight that if you haven't already done so, the sign-up sheet is in the student lounge right across the way for our student night on Thursday night. And I hope you will derive courage from listening to your professors, to your teachers share their work with us to do so. Now we're going to hear from visual artist David Hilliard. He is teaching a new 2-week course here called The Talking Eye. exploring and refining visual language. David creates large-scale, multi-paneled color photographs, often based on his life or the lives of people around him. He exhibits nationally and internationally and has won awards, including the Fulbright and Guggenheim. His photographs can be found in the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, among others. He is a regular visiting faculty at Harvard University, Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and Lesley University. Hilliard's work appears in many publications and is represented by the Yancey Richardson Gallery in New York City, Jackson Fine Art in Atlanta, and in Provincetown by the Schoolhouse Gallery. His work has been called evocative, reflective, lush, and vivid. He is currently in a show at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery about American portraiture today. Please join me in giving a warm Falk welcome to David Hilliard.
Set a little timer for myself. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the great introduction. It is so great to be here again. I can't believe it's been 3 years. And I'm like, I don't even it's amazing how great this space is and how profoundly happy I am to be back here. It's very important to me. So I've been coming here since 2005. So I really missed all of this. I am going, I have a thing here. So this is a pen. This is the thing. Anyway, Elissa, thank you so much. It's like masochistic to follow the writers. I feel like I'm like English as a fourth language after that. It's like, but I'm going to regroup here. Anyway, that was amazing and appropriate for me. For me, a lot of things that I think about too. So I was really moved by that. So I'm going to show some pictures, and we're going. It's a little bit shorter here. So I'm going to do my best not to talk a lot. Because there's just not enough time to say all the things that I have to say about the form and the content. I undermine myself by trying to load up too much. So, and all of you. What I'll say is that my background initially was in theater. I was a theater kid growing up. And that was for me, and it also involved community that I was searching. And so my life and making art, they're in tandem. Which is not that unusual, right? But it's a big part of my work is community. So, theater, storytelling, all of that was super important for me. And then I grew up around photography, so that was not necessarily something I was craving to study. Maybe I should raise this up just a little bit.
Sorry.
No, it's... Is that better? Photography was always in my basement growing up. A little red light hanging. My grandfather was into it. My dad. I just took it for granted, really, and not in a particularly super fine art way, but it was there. When I went to art school via clubs in the 1980s, club kids who were kind of fun and were my crowd. I landed at Mass College of Art and I studied fashion for a hot minute. And then I entered into the film department. My films were theatrical because that was my background, but they were very static. I was politely asked to leave the fashion department, and I was politely again asked to leave the film department, and recommended to leave because the films were super static. They were staring, they would pan across, they were following light, So I was killing the film department, and so I ended up in the photo department, where I should have been all along, because everything I make coalesces into a photograph. So why I'm telling you all this is we're looking at a diptych here, still photograph, theatrical, 2 moments in time, one atop the other, seconds apart, shifting focus, a little bit of theater, a little bit of storytelling, but all comes together in a photograph where I'm allowed to stare. So it's kind of like having my cake and eating it too. So I'm trying to do my best to explain why the multiplicity of photographs. So I always start with this photograph of my dad. It was just the beginning of something for me, trying to honor where I come from. My dad, I grew up lower middle class out of beautiful Lowell, Massachusetts. My dad was a factory worker, a chemical guy, self-taught, never finished high school, very smart, read Playboy magazines at the same time, wore bad shirts, would smoke cheap cigars, all that stuff. So he was, to say the least, enigmatic in a lot of ways. So this first series I'm showing you were just photographs that I started to make while I was in graduate school, where I was photographing cinema, with a bit of cinematic scope to the work. So the first one was called The Lone Wolf. I should say he's reading in the upper panel the first issue of Playboy magazine, and in the foreground was the current issue of Playboy magazine. So thinking about time, thinking about class, taste, masculinity, gay guy, straight father, where to get, all of this stuff is in, and I was at this time I was at Yale in graduate school, and I was studying with, people like Gregory Crutzen and Philip Lorca de Corsia, and it was in the 90s, and so the kind of stage photograph was really happening, and so there was a lot of theater in the early work. My father's shirt, looking at my dad's shirt, and but also looking at Catholic, paint, triptychs and Renaissance painting, and usually I show details as well, but for the sake of time, I'm not. I think there's one where I show details. So, but they do kind of, the focus really shifts from panel to panel. In this one, surprisingly, not so much. This is called His Problem with Plurality. It's a 30-foot-long photograph of my father looking for cornflakes. Born out of the zeitgeist of Seinfeld, really, just like the mundane, the everyday, being worth noticing. I should say that I was heavily influenced by a book, by an exhibition out of MoMA in the 90s called The Pleasures and Terrors of Domestic Comfort. I don't know if anybody knows of this show. But it was the launching pad of a lot of photographers who were not traveling to far-flung places. They were making work in their own backyards, looking at the everyday, that the stories were right in front of us, right in our kitchens and in our bedrooms and in our backyards and in the car and in the supermarket. So there was a lot of that going on. So. But I like that I was part of the problem. This was born out of my father complaining that he can't find the cereal anymore when he goes to his cornflakes. So this kind of kvetching, I can't find it. And I was in graduate school at the time, and I would, have these ideas, but then it would be ruptured by something that was important to him. And so, but I'm part of the problem. I'm just making more cereal. I'm just creating it, but there's one panel where where the narrative changes, where the photograph is a little confused. And spectators, viewers, when they shop this photograph at a gallery, they're still shopping. There's a kind of endurance. You're walking the length of a gallery wall, different, price point, different product, but it's all consumerist. So I'm interested in, American culture, consumerist things, class. So there's lots of things, like all of us, that I'm thinking about. This is called Dad. And when I show this photograph, I talk about how in the first panel we have a shovel resting, peeling paint, a still life. So the genre of still life is a metaphor for his life and getting older and the paint. And then we have the portrait in the middle, and then we have a landscape. So 3 genres of art coalescing into one. But it's really about being a renter in Lowell, Massachusetts, and my father being an isolator. It's funny talking about memoir, because I tell my father's story. I've always told his story, and it's complicated. It's even more complicated now, but that's a Q&A conversation. But I knew, the reason I say that is I knew before I made this photograph, that I was typecasting him as kind of a one-liner, a Hawaiian shirt wearing, Playboy reading, all of it, not particularly complicated, one-dimensional. And he was a lot of other things. And so it was a wake-up call for me that I really owed it to him if I was going to tell his story, to tell it more fully and with specificity, and honor him fully, and not just have people laughing at him. So it took me a while to kind of sneak up on that one. And so then the work continued. This is called Rock Bottom, looking at the two of us, our genetics. I am hardwired to become this. That's me in the other photograph. Thinking about, it could just be a father and son in the water. That's what it is, right? But in between us is a space between us. We have the same tattoos that I got, that he got in the Navy. I am everything he is, and I'm some things that he's not. And so I wanted it to be kind of get to that, our mind and our bodies, and kind of the inevitable things that we become. There's some things we can control. Determination versus determinism, if you will. Tending to doubt. My dad was an atheist. He didn't believe in anything. So these were all the things that he questioned. He kept folders. He was a bit of a hoarder. He would like the marginalia and all of his books. He had thousands of books. He was a voracious reader. This is called Hug. So I'm moving through time quickly. He starts to age, right? When you sign on to a project, those are my students that are here, storytellers. When do you quit? You just keep going, right? Really, unless, the story might end, in different ways. But I knew that I needed to make a photograph of actually hugging him at some point because he was getting older, started to have some health issues. Normally in my work, I would have some kind of action in the mirror, and I knew that it was more about kind of an early goodbye I was thinking about. Neglected heart. It's fun. It's like the world is a stage, getting the cardiologist to allow me to, I didn't like his posters. I bought my own. And so there's a lot of, and they had a really bad, little plastic hearts. I went on, Amazon. I got state of the art, super heart. I'm just, so there's a little bit of theater, a zhuzhing up of things, just definitely tweaking the world. Lover of doves. And then my father had a cardiac event, ended up in the hospital, rehab, and then eventually a nursing home. He never went home. So I was, along with my brother, we were tasked with emptying out his house. And I did it slowly, leaving things like a kind of distillation and leaving his Jesus, which is Henry David Thoreau, his reading chair. The duct tape thing is true, it happens, and his favorite books. And this was another artist, Rania Matar, some of you might know, a friend of mine. She said, David, you really need to photograph this. And because I was grieving because he wasn't well. We found stuff in the pocket of some of his clothing. He had onset dementia going on, and he wrote crib notes on the front of it. It was all the stuff he was afraid of forgetting. And we noticed that he was parroting things. He was saying things at the end. And I was like, why does he keep talking about blah, blah, blah? And so he was a proud guy, so this was stuff that he was trying to hang on to. He was he had a lot of, he was worried about his image for sure. So he ends up in a nursing home, and he became a furniture walker. Some of you in the industry might know what that is. He throws himself from piece of furniture to piece of furniture, wouldn't use a walker, wouldn't use a cane. How do you make a picture of it? How do you photograph in a nursing home? And my dad was like, you got to keep photographing. You got to, he was, because he just wanted me to keep coming. So he was trying to, he knew what would get me there, dangling the carrot of being my subject. So he would do anything. He loved this, and he would tell people to be quiet, and he loved the attention. He also became Mardi Gras king. He tried to keep it a secret because he was afraid that if I found out, we wouldn't come visit him, that he was actually having fun in the nursing home. He didn't want to be there. And there was a while he was trying to convince all the residents to leave at night and jump off the Rourke Bridge. That's a bridge in Lowell. And for real, they was like, you got to control your dad or we have to get him out of here. He was really like a caged animal. It's one of those Afghans that you can have a picture put on. Bubble. So I just was photographing his decline. This is the inconvenience of visitation. Just real quick, at the same time, my parents were divorced when I was 6 years old. My dad's an atheist. My mother lives in Southwest Florida near Fort Myers. She's an evangelical born-again Christian, and this is just a few of these. It's work that I make in her world where I'm not really functioning in the same way photographically. I'm more of a spectator, camera as a foil. It's for me a kind of therapy. I'm just looking at her world that I'm not a part of. I'm not going to be raptured. She lives in a kind of gated Christian community vibe place. Mary Remembering, it's my grandmother and her sister and my mother. My grandmother had dementia as well, and she would just sit there all day long. But her hair was still, from behind, she was still my grandmother. Like, as a kid, I used to love, I was so gay. Like, I would play with her curlers and hand her that she would tell me the colors. But from behind, she was still like her. I could cry looking at this. This is called Perennial. It's every flower in bloom at the same time at Walmart. So I chose this one because my mother loved, and my idea was to make the version of the cereal aisle, but with my mother, like my mother's passion. And I tried it, and it was terrible. She was in the middle. It just wasn't happening. And she stepped out of the frame. And this goes to like thinking what you know your story is going to be, and it's not. Something else happens, and you're blindsided by it, and you got to be open to it. She stepped out, and then suddenly this light shot down, and what do I get but the rapture? Yeah, hello, there it is. It's like that was the version. And I'm not anti-faith. Let me be clear. It's not my faith. I'm a spiritual person. I'm not religious, but I'm certainly not evangelical Christian. And so this is my attempt to kind of imagine what she fantasizes about. Then her second husband died. This is called Widow, but also thinking a picture I made 10 years earlier of my father at a window. Isolated. Then she met husband number 3 at the Elks Lodge. This is called When Lips and Skin Remember, after a Cavafy poem, a Greek poet. So, my mother hits the ground running. She's got a new hairstyle, and the capris are new, and she's a warrior, my mom. And this is Bud from Philadelphia. Let's try this one. And so I always say the same thing. It's like AARP meets From Here to Eternity. It's like that kind of, but it's, geriatric love. I'm sneaking up on it. Caged birds. And this is a holographic Jesus that turns into the Shroud of Turin. And so they just stay home and they just bicker, and they're at the windows and they're futzing with things. And this is the last picture I took when I was there the last time, which was not too long ago. It's called Heyday. There's a lot of alcoholism in my family, both my father and my mother and Bud. And so this is a hard picture for me. There's like the kind of metaphor, like that's the two of them for me in the pool. And then there's Bud, there's drinking. But like my mother's face kills me in this picture because she's not happy and she's not well. And so it's all about, when you're there, you talk about the weather a lot. You don't talk about what's really going on. Okay, looking at men, nuances of maleness. Men I desire, men I'm not, my relationships with men, friends. So my work often deals with maleness. And I know that's super vague, I'm sorry. But you'll get a sense of it as we move through. A lot of strangers, a stranger at a country fair in Connecticut. Still life of a Hulk, him, making comparisons, deep space, Americana. But I think of these fairs from afar, they're kind of beautiful, right, on the horizon. And you get there and it's like, oh boy, you get, it's all a little greasy, a little dangerous. And I also say it's like a candied apple. They look great, but you try to eat one, it's a train wreck. They're just, so it's everything about it is unpleasant. Swimmer, surrogates for myself, children often like me being different. It's called Smoke. I did a residency at 20 Summers here not too long ago, and I made a beautiful series. I really like a bunch of pictures of people in town. Mostly men. Boys tethered, being 15, connected and disconnected, your body changing as quickly as the weather. I love this picture. Still with sticks. I title a lot. I like titles. I like words. I like, I don't know. I can't just make a photograph that doesn't have some kind of long, flowery title. It's called Tangled. Oh, so this boy, I should say, I have a series of this boy I have multiple boys grow up in my work. So this is Bo, whatever years ago, and this is Bo more recently on the left. Aspen, Colorado. This is here in Provincetown. This is called Hail Between Bouts. And then a little bit of queerness in my life, just looking at my own community, myself, and a lot of my own community. This is an early picture called Rising, which was really kind of meaningful for me. Initially, it was going to be 7 panels. It was going to be kind of a visual haiku that was going to, panel by panel, was going to like touch upon something. So, ephemeral time, eternal time, me chasing someone. Just it was going to be this whole story in 7 pictures, and it didn't all come together. But I love the photograph. I like the ambition of it. It's called Andreu. I lived in Barcelona for a little while. But it's really about love for me. Not to be too sappy, but it's like my love of the medium, my love of photography. That's my warning. Just a few more minutes. So it's the thing photographed, the reflection, shadow, in this pyramidical form. It's like everything that makes a photograph. Barcelona, a place I loved. A man I loved. Love. So sweet. And this was at a show. This was actually for an exhibition at the Reina Sofia. There was for a museum show in Barcelona. So I was making work for that museum called Daybooks. Kiss. This kind of voyeuristic through a door. This is actually in Provincetown, 1994, I think. And that's Andreu. We took a trip here. More recent photograph of a partner I had. It's called Unseen, thinking about his unseenness at times. And that's me, but also my being unseen in his relationship. And it's maybe during Q&A we could talk about that because it's agency, because his story is complex. And he's African and Muslim and a million things to overcome. And we were in love, and it didn't work. It just we were so, but I love this photograph. But that's as close as I could make of a picture of the two of us together. But I'm telling his story. I show this one here because this was a commission for New York Magazine. So I made this photograph for that, and the same week I made this photograph called Another Bite. It's my father in the nursing home getting new dentures. The one in his right hand are from 1955, if you can believe it, and the new one's in his left hand. And it's kind of a grim photograph. I'm holding his head. It was a kind of a tough picture. And then, this is where I sometimes get upset. So a week after I made the denture photograph, COVID swept through the nursing home. And it took a lot of people. It took 19 residents and 2 staff, in a very short period of time. This is in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. And so my poor dad, went quick. But no pain, right? So I'm not gonna, sorry. Anyway, I'm back. So it's no pain, happened quick, a dark blessing, right? But I have to back up and say that we had curated our photography together so carefully. He was to be embalmed when he prepaid his funeral. His headstone said, "Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads," quote by Henry David Thoreau. Had 2 swallows on the stone. We designed it together. For a guy who never ever was proactive about anything, his was obsessively micromanaged. So he had it all worked out. And this is not what he wanted. He didn't want to go in a vase. That's what he said. I don't want to be cremated. He died early. People didn't want to deal with COVID bodies. He had to be, and we couldn't gather anyway to do anything, so he got cremated. And so my brother and I chose an urn that looked like a casket. And my father sat in my living room for a year and a half or so before one day I said, I got to make something. And so I went on Craigslist and I got this little table, which is it's two types of table put together. It's Beaux Arts and Federal. It doesn't really make sense as a table. And so that seemed perfect for my dad. And I took him to all of his favorite places. This is Dad at Man-Made Pond. This is in southern New Hampshire. And there's a series of about 10 or 12 photographs that really just chronicle my grief and taking him around, hanging out with him one last time. This is in Maine, in western Maine. So the whole series is Dad at Father's Day. Dad at his favorite diner. This one had to be handled very carefully. I had a photo assistant who distracted. He made a scene over by the beer cooler, and I threw that up there, and we took it fast. But it was. And this is the second to last photograph. This is right at the foot of the cemetery. So this is my dad at what I thought was the Merrimack River, but it's the Concord River. And I didn't know it until you can't see it. If I showed you the details, you would. In the left-hand photograph way at the end, there's a guy fishing. So while I'm setting up there, the guy says, "Hey, what's going on, young kid?" And we're chatting. He doesn't know that I have my father's ashes on a table. He couldn't really see it from where I was. But he said, he's fishing. He said, "Yeah, my dad," he said to me, "My dad and I used to like to fish here all the time." And I said, "Oh, yeah, my dad didn't fish much, but he loved the Merrimack River." And he said, "No, this is the Concord River." And the Concord River and the Merrimack River, this might be so uninteresting to all of you, but my dad loved the Concord River. And I didn't know it was the Concord River. And it's like he had this whole thing about Walden Pond and the Concord River and the existentialists and Thoreau and Emerson. And so anyway, so he's saying all of that, and then it starts to rain, and I could make this whole picture, and he tells me all the stuff about his father. We're talking about our dads. And, I just had this moment of everything, and I don't talk about higher power, but a lot of things happened at the end near my father's funeral that made me think about it, I'm not at the Walmart in the rapture mode yet, but I do, as I grow older and things happen to me, and maybe during Q&A, I want to tell you a story about the manufacturer of that urn. I got an email today that blew my mind. Because the show of the lily pad one, that's the one that's at the National Portrait Gallery, and somebody from the company saw it and has a story to tell about that urn. And anyway, and he didn't like Trump, and this was the kind of perfect kind of photograph to, and this is the last one I think that I'm going to show, and it's my dad's last cigar. It's his favorite beer stein. And had I known this thing was so reflective. Now I know because of this email exactly what you call that urn. It has a high gloss, and I would have made other pictures that dealt with reflection. And that's all of the mail that he had gotten since his departure since he died. And he loved a Rubik's Cube. So it's really like the last hurrah. He was buried the next morning. And that's it. I did it. I came in. So that's what I'm showing you today. Thank you very much. I don't know if I should.
Thank you so much, David. That was some really beautiful and moving work. So we're actually going to bring both of you back on stage for a Q&A with the audience.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm kidding.
Can you hear me? Hello? Oh, no?
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it's on. Hello? Do I have to press something?
No, it should be on.
Hello? Testing? No? We almost did this flawlessly. We had to have every time there's a little touch of something.
No, if you feel comfortable without the microphone, you can
Well,
speak
can you hear
loudly.
us, or should we?
Yeah? Okay, great. Fantastic.
We'll keep our voices
We'll
up.
be good. Yeah. Hello, everyone.
So I don't know, I think that people can ask a couple of questions to us, or?
I have a mic here too. Hello.
That
This
way.
one's working.
Can you talk a little bit about the give and take with your dad when you were creating work? I mean, how did that go, and how much did he help you, like, frame stuff? I mean, he's so much a part of them.
Yeah, it was definitely a collaboration. In the beginning, I was in school. It wasn't such a stretch to ask him to lay in bed and read a Playboy. It was kind of like typecasting. Like a lot of that stuff was kind of happening, and he was into it. My dad was a really kind of creative guy, and he loved photography, and he loved spending time with me. We were super close. We had a great relationship, and so we had a lot of fun, and we would talk about it. I think it did start to, at some point, get a little bit more uncomfortable when he was opening up journals for me to look at. There's a lot of stuff I didn't show you. But he understood. He understood, and I had a discussion with him that I want to tell you a story. I don't want to just have you, because he knew that the work was getting out there. I'd gone to graduate school, there were shows. He loved what was happening to me. I mean, he would love that his picture is at the Smithsonian. He loved the Smithsonian. It's like perfect. Like it was like, oh my God. I was happy to get in the show. It was a juried show, but I was more happy because my dad loved that museum so much. But it was discussed a lot. But in the end, he kind of gave himself over to me. There was very little that he would say no to. Like the supermarket, he didn't want to go there. He was kind of shy, and there were people around, and the lake. When we're in the water, there's like people watching us, and but he gave it up. He knew that a bigger thing was happening with the work. So he knew that I really needed it, and he liked it. In the end, he knew that he was. I'll show up in a second. He did say when in the nursing home before he fully lost his memory, he said, you need to keep photographing. You need to keep this project. It's your best work. Like you said.
My follow-up, what did he think of your erotic work?
He was okay with it. My dad was cool. Like he was like, he didn't say, yeah, rah, rah, you're gay. But he was like, he knew all my partners, and but he was on board with all of it. And he loved to work with my mother because he always thought I was making fun of her.
My mother, when I wrote Motherland, she didn't have the same reaction. She wasn't like, yay, this is great. One of the questions that I get a lot is, does your mother know that you're writing this book about, the two of you? And she did, and she was furious, and because she suffers from narcissistic personality disorder, clinically diagnosed NPD, she still refers to it as the book about her. So it's interesting because I was looking at the triptych of the two of you in the water, and you're very, you're looking in very different directions. I was going to say I could have my students just look at that and write numerous pieces based on
We were
that.
talking about that at my workshop about collaborating with. It's fun to switch that up.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I have to say I was moved by, and I don't remember what you said exactly about writing and not knowing necessarily where, like keeping it open to at the beginning. And I don't know if it was just this book you're doing now. Like I don't know if that's usually your thing, but that's how I photograph.
Yeah, I always talk about letting go of the steering wheel and the fact that you can go into a project planning to do this thing, and that thing is not what you end up with, and you have to be open to it, and you can't sort of pull the horse this way and pull the horse that way, and letting go of the reins is really hard because we all come to the work we do with at least writerly with preconceived plans for we're going to write a story about this or a memoir about this or a poem about this, and it doesn't work that way.
The metaphor for life doesn't work that way either.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
I have a question for each of you. I wondered if you could tell the urn story.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered whether you were able to, in terms of the story of your father and the abandonment, if you, by telling the story, were able to rid yourself in any way of that sense of abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat what the question was back to us, because we couldn't hear?
Oh, I was asked to repeat the story about getting the email about the urn that my father's in.
And I was asked about whether or not in writing the story of my father's abandonment was able to allow me to rid myself of that, of the abandonment as well. So. Sure, yeah, it's very true that, at least certainly in my experience, that there is, if you have a particular core story, and I consider this a fundamental core story in my family, it's almost Greek in its power. I couldn't not write about it. I was so compelled to write about it. I was, like you, I was extremely close to my dad, and I lost him tragically in a car accident, and suffered a break from my family. And this was, sort of a break from my family long before the book came out. And I felt, I knew, I had grown up with the tales of his being so, the abandoned little boy. I mean, literally the abandoned little boy. And to have a sister who just wouldn't talk about it, not going to talk about it. He carried this trauma with him every day of his life through 2 marriages, and past that sense, that fear of abandonment, which I think is a foundational fear for all of us, passed that on to me. In writing about it, I think that I was honoring his, memory and his broken heart in some way. And it took me a while to realize that. I still think about it, all the time, and issues of abandonment in many ways work their way into my pieces, as if I didn't have any control over it. So, but thank you.
My story is not nearly as interesting as that. A couple of hours ago, I got an email from someone in Springfield, Mass, who said, "You don't know me, my name is blah, blah, blah." It's being recorded, well, anyway. And he said that I have a cousin who went to the National Portrait Gallery and saw your photograph of your father's. First, he gave his condolences. He says, "My company manufactures those. It's the Mackenzie 5000, whatever, it's the name of it." And he said, it's a 3rd generation company, we make that, and it's like it's like really amazing, and the story's really touching. And then he went on to say that my partner and I, love the work, and we come to Provincetown, and the whole, turns out that he's a gay guy, and he's a partner, they have a place in P-Town. And then on their website, they have pictures of, throughout history, him as a child with his dad, making those, literally the same exact one.
Wow.
And I got, chills. I was just I told a friend, they're like, well, yeah, so I thought it was really fascinating. I said, because again, I'm interested in these fathers, but there's 6 degrees of separation, these connections that happen, that it would that I would choose an urn, the Mackenzie 5000, that ended up being, manufactured by a gay guy, and I don't know, that it went kind of back to a father and a son, and then he and his dad were really close, and it just was a beautiful another caress to the project. I was like, damn, that was I don't know, it's like the ripple effect of that, and how, I can put something out into the world, and then somebody else's life collides with it, and then they shout back to me, and so and it was just hours before this talk, so it was just really remarkable.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I like stuff like that.
Hi. Okay. My question is for Elissa, and that was very beautiful. Your photography is gorgeous, and your scenes are fabulous and moving. Elissa, how much credit or responsibility of being a writer do you give to your father's story? I mean, do you think that opened up the doors to your pathway to being a writer?
Yeah, you all heard that, right? Yeah. I would say that, very, very much so, without without question. I mean, we are a family of storytellers and veteran storytellers. We tell the stories over and over and over again, whatever the stories may be. And unless you're in my aunt's house, which you're not, you're playing golf, but that's neither here nor there. But my father would tell the story over and over again. I don't know I'm not an observant person at all. I know in the Jewish faith, you read the Torah portion and you start at the beginning of the new year, and you do the same thing for the New Testament. That you read the same thing over and then there are different interpretations of the different stories, and so that's ubiquitous. That's a universal practice, I think, and that's what he did. From the time I was very, very little, and listening to a story about maternal abandonment when you're this big and you're not so connected to your mom. It was very frightening, but he told it over and over again, I think, as a way to metabolize it and try and heal from it. And I grew up until he left the house at the divorce when I was 16, hearing that story over and over again. And I think that it embedded itself in me and in my not desire to be a writer, but the fact that I had to be. I had to continue telling the story in some way and making some sense out of it. And of course, the interesting thing is that, it's a story of abandonment, and as a result of it, I was abandoned by the family for telling it again. It's a really, and I do think that if there is a story that you carry in you, and we do carry stories in ourselves at the most visceral level, they have to be told in some way, whether it's visual or it's in writing or it's in music. Stories need to be told, and they must be told. They demand it.
Can I add something to that, to what you just said? What resonates for me with you telling your story through and getting to the healing process, Joni Mitchell's story was exactly the same, in that she became a writer and a singer of songs because, she didn't marry Graham Nash because she wanted to fulfill her dreams as a woman that she saw her grandmother and her mother unable to fulfill and live with that kind of resentment. And you bring your father's fruition to be with your healing of that history through your ability to tell that story.
Yeah.
And so,
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to ask you about your life as teacher. How do you help your students find that core story? I mean, each of you has that. And do you begin by sharing your own work with them? How do you help them open up?
That's a great question.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things I say right away when I teach on any level is I implicate myself. I don't necessarily show my work right away, but I say, listen, what you're doing is like I'm doing a version of that. I'm just older than you, or I've been at it longer than you, but I lay in bed at night thinking about content and the story to tell and agency and all of this stuff. We all share that. Any artist worth their weight is like, I'm very concerned about my work, and I think about it all the time. I'm consumed by it sometimes, and I don't always get it right, and I fail. And so I guess what I do is I kind of humanize myself a little bit, and it's a pretty simple strategy, but I like to think that makes people comfortable. And I say things like, give critique from the positive, be constructive, qualify, quantify. I have all these things, they teach you things, but it's just reminding people to be human and be like, but I think first and foremost, I do teach from eventually my work. I don't show it right away because that sometimes can be confusing for students because then I make work just like that formally. But I operate from a place of putting myself in the picture. I'm on the front lines of creativity as well. So it doesn't matter where you are in your career, you're always pushing forward. People think that you arrive somewhere, you never really arrive at the station.
Never.
I don't think so.
No, definitely not. Yeah, I think that for me, I mean, whether my students come into a place like this, having read my work, that's fine, but I usually don't bring my work into the classroom for the same reason you don't. It's really important to me when I'm teaching to get across the idea that when my students come, they come with 10 pages of work, right? 10 pages of work, which is a very small amount. And sometimes it's a chapter from a longer piece, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's some shorter work in progress. But across the board, I try and I ask them to listen to the work and to read the work aloud to themselves and see how much they're trying to fill in the story, in what they've written. And there's often a lot of description and a lot of action and a lot of movement and a lot of names. And over the course of the week or the month, I try and get them to understand that the creation of something like memoir or personal essay is almost like a whittling process. And I describe it again in culinary terms of we all have the experience of shaving a carrot, and you go too far and there's nothing left. But you've got to whittle the work down to get what is not necessarily necessary there. And usually when they do that and they pay really close attention to what the story is trying to tell them and they let go of the reins, the core of the story that it begins to emerge. And you really have to sort of listen to it. You have to listen to it and you have to be open-minded about it because it may not be what you want. It very often isn't. And so there's always an element of bravery involved, and memoir is a scary form and vulnerable form. But listening and thinking and focusing on the fact that more information is not necessarily better, it's just more. So peeling back and paring back and shaving back is what I always hope for. So.
I like to use the word listening.
Yeah.
At least in the classroom, we talked about listening, not just to yourself, but you live vicariously through your peers, your other students, but really in critique to listen to what people are saying. They're talking about the work, and don't run at it with your agenda right away. And try to enter it through their story, through their eyes, and because we all have our own principles, we all have our own beliefs, but it's to remind students at any age that you really you have to listen to the terms of the person and do your best to enter it into it through their intentions. Because if not, you undermine yourself and you undermine them, and you don't grow if you don't really try to enter the work through somebody else's eyes as much or words as much as possible. So I think we forget to talk about listening a lot.
Yeah, and I think when we're surrounded all the time by noise of every kind, and we have our iPhones and we have our computers and we have this and we have that, and, you know, when we're all reading all the time, we're all looking at work all the time. And it's important to just to take a step back and listen to what the work is trying to tell you in a almost, you know, a quiet way.
Has there ever been any work when you're saying you're listening to it, and you come to like a new content, you say, this is too scary, or this is too personal, or this turf is too edgy for me to write about? Do you find that is a place, and maybe it's too personal to ask if you're...
No,
Yeah,
it's totally fine. I mean, I was talking, I think, to one of my students today about the fact that I didn't know when I wrote Motherland that that was going to come out when it came out. That the book was going to be published while my mother is still very much with us. You know, knock wood, she's still with us. But there are certain stories that that sit on my shoulder and scream in my ear all the time that I cannot write until, or I cannot try and publish until she's no longer here. They're that potentially not problematic, but they're so searing that it just, you know, she wouldn't have any way to metabolize it. So.
Maybe to piggyback on that, I think maybe a similar or a different angle of the same question is there, like the word protection keeps coming to mind, and working with personal content like this, do you ever, you know, the way you just answered that question was very much of like, she couldn't sort of process it, or you wouldn't want to put it out there, so she has to confront it. But is there ever this sort of blurry, like, struggle with, you know, oh, maybe this approach, whether it's through the writing or photography, maybe doesn't shed like the best light, or reveals something that you know, again, like maybe it's a little too real, or you just feel compelled to not, or you struggle with that?
You know, Dorothy Allison has this great quote that if you are going to write someone or a situation in which a character, family member, friend is depicted, pardon my expletive, as a raging asshole, you better really be prepared to write about yourself in the exact same way, you know. Again, the Vivian Gornick quote, you know, for the drama to deepen, you need to see the cunning of the innocent and the loneliness of the monster. You know, everybody has to be seen from every angle. So if I'm writing something in which a character is particularly awful in some way, I have to understand why that person is in the work to begin with. Otherwise, it begins to list into revenge writing, which, bad idea, no revenge writing. But I also have to see my role in it as well. And I have to write it with an absolutely unvarnished eye.
Was that for me as well?
Yeah, I mean, the
I'm
same
sorry,
thing with,
I'll just let the building.
well, like you were referencing, like feeling maybe with the photographs that some, you know, you felt like it might be reducing him to a sort of caricature.
Yeah, I mean, that's all the time, especially, not so much with my dad, because I think even if that happened, he wouldn't care so much. My dad was pretty cool. He enjoyed it, and he was that way with himself. He telegraphed that all the time, that he showed himself as a one-dimensional person all the time. Because showing who he was fully that took a kind of bravery that my dad didn't have. Sad. My dad went to his grave full of secrets and full of shame about his lack of education. And my mother's very different. She puts it all out there, and she's, you know, proud of her New England accent and packs a and she's like, she just goes at it. But I am aware with my mother that I could hurt her feelings very easily. And I love my mother. I don't always like her. My mother and I are not super close. But, you know, my mother's my mother. But I certainly have chosen family that I'm a lot tighter with. My dad, no. My dad was my love of my life. But my mother, I still guard her. That's why I asked, is this being recorded? Because I pick on her a little bit, but I have no desire to fully disrespect her. I could make photographs that were much more judgmental, because they're really not. They're really like, this isn't the real picture. When I go there, it's hard being there. It's hard to be a gay man in my mother's right-leaning, narrow-minded, bigoted world. Like, it's hard. Like, a lot of kids wouldn't show up to that. I'm not saying I'm a hero. And a lot of artists would paint, like, there's a lot of, I can name photographers who would really kind of show it. I don't want to do that. I like it to be there if you want to, and I talk about it, and I like the viewer to have room to kind of make some of their own conclusions, choose a camp, and so I try to keep it open. I try to make it, maybe with humor, I kind of laugh a little bit at her, but so I'm very fiercely loyal to the people I photograph, even strangers. I don't think I have one photograph up there that would really ultimately hurt somebody's feelings too much. And I certainly don't title it in any way that is provocative or would allude to something that was not the truth. I mean, I'm not interested in that. I mean, the truth is already juicy enough, really.
That's very true.
Maybe time for one question or two more questions, see if there was any more.
Jill?
I have a question about the photograph of the panel about the county fair.
Yeah.
In that case, is that something, presumably it's not something you just happened upon and had your equipment and all these systems. It's something you came back to?
No, I had my equipment, like, I happened upon that. So I went to the fair, he was there. He's the kind of guy that if in real time without a camera, if I had stared at him for too long, he probably would have like punched me, kind of thing. But I was curious, I saw him right away, and I was like I just, I mean, all kidding aside, like, I'm sometimes attracted to dangerous looking guys. But I was drawn to him, like I was, and he was interesting, and I talked to him, and I had a photo assistant with me, and he's a volunteer fire department. He was going off to fight in Iraq. I sent him the picture. I never heard back from him. So when I look at that picture every time, I hope he's okay. I love that photograph. If I were him, I'd be like, yeah. But he didn't like when he saw that I was making a comparison with the Hulk. Like he did. He had some friends that were kind of laughing. I got 2 shots of him, and he wasn't into anything else. But I will also, in closing, say about that picture that I was interviewed. Aperture did a monograph a long time ago, and Vince Aletti, a critic and music critic, interviewed me at the back of that book. And Vince Aletti's a gay guy, older than me, but it was a long time ago. So there was, like, I think I was younger, and he was kind of professorial. And he said, "Do you think that he would have looked at you that way had it not been for the camera?" Which is kind of a, straight, but you know what, I never thought about it. Like, he's not looking at me. He's looking at whoever he thinks. It's kind of like when people do selfies, like you project where you think it's gonna go, and so he's looking at who he thinks, like that's, so that kind of leering look, like I could not have gotten to look at him or gotten him to look at that way had it not been for optical equipment. And so he wasn't fully seeing me, and I wasn't fully seeing him. Like we were just like, so there's something. It's all about the lens and whatever we both think that thing's going to be. So it's a suspended kind of reality. I'm getting a little bit like that's, but I think about that. But that came from a critic pointing that out to me. So whenever I'm photographing somebody now, I'm aware that it's often not about me at all. I used to think it was all about me. No.
So I bumped into him last week, and he's been fantasizing you about you.
Really? Oh, good. I don't think that was I'm glad he's okay. Thank him for his service.
Okay.
There was a question over here.
Was there one more
I just
question?
had one quick, so many memoirs are about family, mothers, fathers, and photography. Someone was saying they would never think of writing about their children, because it's too intense. Do either of you have notions of things you might want to really explore that aren't family? Like, does anyone do a memoir about a dear, dear friend in like 300 pages? But I don't know.
When I think about that, I mean, immediately I go to Gail Caldwell's wonderful, wonderful memoir about her platonic relationship with the memoirist Caroline Knapp. And it is a breathtakingly beautiful, beautiful memoir. And yeah, I think certainly for me, my family is very important. And again, the telling of the story, the abandonment story, and the healing story, and which is sort of a word that gets thrown around a lot. But there is so much around us that is happening right now, and so much that I see, and I think that when we write about family, we write these big stories. We take on these big issues, and what I find really compelling, apart from the fact that I'm getting older, this is going to be my fourth book that's coming out, is the mundane, the mundane, the small, the everyday, absolutely captivates me. And I remember the novel Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner, and everybody said, oh, that's right, no one's ever going to make never going to be a movie, blah, 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 there's no sex in it, blah, blah, blah. Which is true, and it's a novel about two couples that, and it follows them from the 1930s, from the end of the Depression, the middle of the Depression, through the 1970s. It begins at the end. And it is a story about the beauty of the mundane, and how pristine it is in terms of being the core human subject, but we have to look at it. We have to open our eyes. We have to put our phones down. We have to listen to people and think about what they're saying, and look around ourselves, And I mean, I love your work is hardly about the mundane, but it's extraordinary, and part of the reason why it's extraordinary and engaging is very compelling is because of that, the connection, the magic and the mundane. So, yeah, I don't know what's going to be next, but it'll wake me up in the night after the next one is over, and it'll let me know. So.
And I think every artist has things in play that I'll just quickly throw my 2 cents in about that. I have one project about a friend that was troubled. It's one of my dear friends, was once a boyfriend, had mental illness, is no longer with us. It's too painful for me to touch those pictures right now, but they exist. But I showed one photograph of a once boyfriend who were no longer together. He was African. He was here on political asylum from Africa. And so through that relationship, I met a community of people, African men, Caribbean men, and many of them gay, not all of them, but telling their stories, and a lot of them seeking asylum. A lot of them, especially people who were being persecuted because of their sexual preference. With their lives, some of them injured, coming back physically and certainly emotionally. And so I made these photographs that, in collaboration with them, with their story, with writing, and a lot of them are really beautiful, and some of them are really stylized, and it's kind of out of a dialogue with that person. And for a lot of these men, it's the first time that they've been photographed as, some of them are kind of sexy. Like they're really kind of like they're performing for the camera, and I don't know what the hell to do with that work. I like a lot of the pictures, but it's a question of agency. It's a question of their like there's I'm making the work. I have the photographs. Some of them are really great, but it feels a little hot right now. Like it feels like I don't quite for a lot of reasons. And so we all should tell a story. I think you said something, but like I tell stories like nobody owns, like everybody can run it, subject matter, but responsibility, that's our word, that could be slippery, and you have to pay attention to that. And like now more than ever, man. But I want to feel free to look at whatever I want to look at, and I can just say, well, it's because I have an African boyfriend. No. So, and I know that, but I'm making the work, and it's in a hard drive, it's in boxes. I want to make the work, but I'm not going public with it yet because I haven't quite figured out where my footing is in the work. It makes me a little afraid.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Okay. So we're going to wrap things up now. Thank you, Elissa and David. Can we have another round of applause, please? Remember to check out books and merchandise for sale in our bookstore and at the back of the room. And Elissa and David will be signing books for you up here at the front of the room. And please remember to visit our gallery next door. We hope you'll come back tomorrow at 6 p.m. for another faculty event featuring writer Gabby Calvacaresi and visual artists Forrest Williams and Daniel Heyman. Thank you and have a great evening.